The HOA lady pulled the fire alarm during my daughter's therapy session. My 8-year-old has autism and the loud noise made her scream and shake badly. The woman smiled when she saw my child suffering. She didn't know I'm the county sheriff and she just made a big mistake. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The piercing sound of the fire alarm shattered the peaceful silence of the therapy center at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that would forever change our lives. But this wasn't just any ordinary false alarm. This was the moment my world turned upside down, and a vindictive woman's cruelty toward my disabled daughter would lead to her own spectacular downfall that she never saw coming. My name is Detective Sheriff Marcus Thompson, and I've spent 23 years protecting and serving our county with unwavering dedication. I've seen the worst of humanity: murderers who sleep peacefully after taking innocent lives, thieves who steal from elderly victims without remorse, drug dealers who poison children for profit, and every kind of criminal you can imagine lurking in the shadows of society. I've walked through crime scenes that would haunt most people's nightmares, investigated cases that would break lesser men's spirits, and faced down armed suspects who had nothing left to lose. But nothing, absolutely nothing in my entire career, prepared me for the pure, calculated evil I would witness that day from someone who was supposed to be a respected pillar of our community. It started 6 months earlier when my daughter Emma and I moved into Willowbrook Estates, an upscale HOA community that advertised itself as promoting family values and peaceful living for discerning residents. The glossy brochures showed children playing happily in well-maintained parks, families enjoying barbecues in perfectly manicured backyards, and neighbors greeting each other with warm smiles along tree-lined streets. It looked like the perfect place to rebuild our shattered lives and give Emma the stable, nurturing environment she desperately needed to heal from the traumatic loss that had torn our world apart. Emma, my precious 8-year-old angel with eyes as blue as summer skies and a smile that could light up the darkest room, had been through more trauma than any child should ever have to endure in a lifetime. Born with severe autism spectrum disorder and generalized anxiety that made everyday interactions feel like climbing mountains, she had spent most of her young life struggling to find her place in a world that often seemed too loud, too bright, too overwhelming, and too unpredictable for her incredibly sensitive soul. Simple things that other children took for granted, the sound of a vacuum cleaner, the texture of certain fabrics, unexpected changes in routine, or crowds of people, could send Emma into hours-long meltdowns that left her physically and emotionally exhausted. After my beloved wife Sarah died in a horrific car accident 2 years ago when a drunk driver ran a red light and destroyed everything beautiful in our lives, Emma's already fragile condition deteriorated dramatically. She stopped speaking entirely for months, communicating only through desperate gestures and heartbreaking tears. She would have violent meltdowns that lasted for hours, during which she would hit herself, scream until her voice was hoarse, and rock back and forth in a corner while I sat helplessly beside her, whispering words of comfort that seemed to disappear into the void of her pain. She couldn't bear to be touched by anyone except me, flinching away from well-meaning relatives and friends as if their hands burned her skin. The grief counselors said it was normal for children with autism to regress after traumatic loss, but watching my daughter disappear deeper into herself while I remained powerless to reach her was the most agonizing experience of my life. The doctors at the Regional Children's Hospital explained that Emma's therapy sessions with Dr. Rebecca Martinez weren't just helpful appointments, they were literally her lifeline to recovery and her only realistic hope of ever living anything resembling a normal, happy life. Dr. Martinez was a miracle worker who specialized in trauma recovery for children with autism spectrum disorders. She had spent over 15 years developing innovative techniques that helped nonverbal children find their voices again, taught overwhelmed kids how to process their emotions without self-destructive behaviors, and slowly rebuilt the confidence and trust that trauma had cruelly stolen from innocent souls. Over the course of 8 months of intensive therapy, Dr. Martinez had managed to coax Emma into speaking her first words since her mother's death. Those words were "Mama hurt," whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear them, but they represented a breakthrough that brought tears of hope to my eyes. She helped Emma learn to identify and express her emotions using visual cards and gentle role-playing exercises instead of erupting into the devastating meltdowns that had become our daily reality. Most importantly, she was slowly, carefully rebuilding Emma's shattered sense of safety in a world that had proven it could take away everything she loved without warning. These therapy sessions weren't just appointments on our calendar, they were sacred hours when Emma felt safe enough to be vulnerable, moments when she could practice being a child again without fear of judgment or overwhelming sensory assault. The therapy center had become Emma's refuge, the one place outside our home where she could let down her guard and work on healing the invisible wounds that autism and trauma had carved into her young heart. The therapy center was perfectly located just next to our new neighborhood, a convenient 5-minute walk from our house that took us down a quiet side street lined with oak trees that Emma loved to count as we passed. This proximity was an unexpected blessing because Emma found car rides extremely distressing. The vibrations, engine noise, and unpredictable movements triggered her sensory sensitivities and often resulted in meltdowns before we even reached our destination. The familiar walking route gave her a sense of security and routine that was absolutely essential for her continued progress. She had memorized every house number, every garden gnome, every crack in the sidewalk, and this predictability helped calm her anxiety about venturing into the outside world. Karen Blackwood was a 52-year-old real estate agent who had appointed herself as the neighborhood's moral guardian, self-proclaimed HOA president, and unofficial judge of who deserved to live in her perfect community. She was the kind of person who measured her lawn with an actual ruler to ensure it met the exact HOA specifications down to the millimeter, who called code enforcement on neighbors for leaving their trash cans out 10 minutes past the designated pickup time, who patrolled the streets looking for violations of community standards that existed only in her twisted imagination, and who seemed to derive genuine, sadistic pleasure from making other people's lives as miserable as possible. Her house was a monument to obsessive control, every blade of grass perfectly trimmed, every flower planted in precise geometric patterns, every outdoor decoration positioned with military precision. From the very first day we moved our belongings into our new home, Karen made it crystal clear that she not only disapproved of Emma's existence in her pristine neighborhood, but actively resented our presence as a contamination of her vision of suburban perfection. She began her campaign of harassment immediately, starting with passive-aggressive complaints disguised as neighborly concern. She knocked on our door to inform me that Emma's occasional stimmying behaviors in our own backyard, the hand-flapping and rocking motions that helped her self-regulate when feeling overwhelmed, were disruptive to the community's peace and property values, and made other residents uncomfortable. When I explained that these were harmless self-soothing behaviors related to Emma's autism, Karen's response was chillingly cold. Well, perhaps she should do that inside where normal people don't have to see it. Her harassment escalated quickly and relentlessly. She filed formal written complaints with the HOA board about Emma's service dog, Lucky, a gentle golden retriever who had been specially trained to recognize Emma's anxiety attacks and provide deep pressure therapy during meltdowns. Karen alleged that Lucky's presence violated the community's no pets policy, despite my providing extensive documentation proving Lucky was a legitimate service animal protected under federal law. She demanded to see Lucky's certification papers, insisted on inspecting his training records, and even went so far as to call animal control with false reports that Lucky was aggressive and threatening to neighborhood children. But Karen's cruelty reached truly despicable levels when she had the audacity to corner me in the grocery store parking lot and suggest that Emma would be better served in a special facility designed for children with her problems, rather than living in a normal neighborhood with normal families who have a right to peaceful enjoyment of their property. Her exact words, delivered with a sweet smile that made them even more venomous, were, "You know, there are places specifically designed for people like your daughter. Wouldn't she be happier somewhere she fits in better?" The implication was clear. Emma wasn't welcome in Karen's version of an acceptable community, and Karen was prepared to make our lives hell until we voluntarily left. But Karen's obsession reached a dangerous new level when she discovered that Emma was attending therapy sessions at the Rainbow Bridge Therapy Center located just beyond our neighborhood's borders. She became consumed with the idea that the therapy center was somehow violating HOA regulations and bringing undesirable elements into the vicinity of her perfect community. She spent countless hours researching obscure municipal codes, measuring property lines with surveying equipment she purchased specifically for this purpose, photographing the center's parking lot, and documenting the license plates of every car that visited the facility. She was looking for any possible legal angle to shut down what she called the source of damaged people infiltrating our community. Karen began calling the therapy center directly, harassing the staff with demands to know exactly which neighborhood residents were receiving services there. When they rightfully refused to violate patient confidentiality, she threatened to report them to various regulatory agencies for operating outside their permitted scope. She filed false complaints with the city's zoning department, claiming the therapy center was operating a commercial medical facility in an area zoned for different purposes, despite the fact that the center was properly licensed and had operated in that location for over a decade without any issues. She even attended city council meetings, demanding that the therapy center's license be revoked because it attracted troubled individuals who threatened the safety and property values of nearby residential areas. Her presentations included carefully edited photos that made the therapy center look like some kind of dangerous institution, manipulated statistics about crime rates near medical facilities, and outright lies about disruptions and safety concerns that existed only in her imagination. When all of her official channels failed to produce the results she wanted, Karen decided to take more direct action. She began following Emma and me on our walks to therapy, staying just far enough back to avoid accusations of stalking but close enough to make her presence known and intimidating. She would park her car across from the therapy center during Emma's sessions, sitting there for the entire hour with a notebook, writing down arrival and departure times, photographing families as they entered and left, and generally creating an atmosphere of surveillance and hostility that other parents found deeply disturbing. On that fateful Tuesday afternoon in late October, Emma was having one of her most significant breakthrough sessions with Dr. Martinez in months. The autumn leaves were falling gently outside the therapy room's large windows, creating a peaceful atmosphere that Emma found calming and beautiful. For the first time in weeks, she had managed to complete an entire 100-piece puzzle without having a single meltdown, had successfully identified and named 7 different emotions using the colorful feeling cards, had engaged in a 10-minute conversation about her favorite book without becoming overwhelmed, and was even beginning to talk about her mother's memory without dissolving into the inconsolable tears that usually accompanied any mention of Sarah. The progress was absolutely extraordinary, the kind of breakthrough that Dr. Martinez had been working toward for months of patient, careful therapy. Emma was finally beginning to trust the world around her again, slowly letting down the walls that trauma had built around her heart, and taking those crucial first steps toward becoming the happy, confident child she had been before grief and loss had stolen her voice and her joy. I was sitting in the comfortable waiting room, watching through the one-way observation window as my daughter slowly, beautifully rebuilt herself piece by piece. As a father who had spent 2 years watching his child suffer in ways I couldn't fix or heal, seeing Emma smile genuinely, laugh spontaneously, and engage with the world around her was the most beautiful, hopeful thing imaginable. She was finally beginning to look forward instead of backward, finally starting to believe that good things could happen to her again, finally taking those precious first steps toward the happiness that every child deserves. That's when I noticed Karen's distinctive silver BMW pulling into the therapy center's parking lot with the aggressive speed and determination of someone on a mission. At first, I desperately hoped it was just a coincidence. Maybe she had legitimate business somewhere nearby, or perhaps she was finally seeking professional help for the obvious psychological issues that drove her to torment innocent families. But as I watched her emerge from her car and march toward the building with that familiar look of self-righteous determination burning in her eyes, that cold, familiar dread settled heavily in my stomach like a stone. Karen stormed through the therapy center's front door like a woman possessed by demons of hatred and prejudice. Her face was flushed bright red with barely controlled rage, her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her eyes were wild with the kind of fanatical fury that comes from someone who believes they are fighting a holy war against perceived injustices that exist only in their twisted imagination. She was carrying a thick folder stuffed with papers, which I would later learn contained her evidence of various imagined violations, infractions, and neighborhood threats that she had been compiling obsessively for months. This establishment is operating in clear violation of multiple municipal codes and zoning regulations, she shrieked at Mrs. Patterson, the kind elderly receptionist who had welcomed families to the therapy center for over 8 years. Karen's voice echoed through the peaceful, carefully designed therapeutic environment like nails scraping across a chalkboard, shattering the calm atmosphere that the staff worked so hard to maintain for their vulnerable young patients. I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this operation immediately. This place has no right to exist in proximity to our residential community. Mrs. Patterson, a grandmother who had dedicated her retirement years to helping children with special needs, tried her best to respond with the professional courtesy and patience that the situation required. She calmly explained that the Rainbow Bridge Therapy Center was fully licensed by the state, in complete compliance with all local and federal regulations, properly zoned for their current operations, and had maintained a spotless record with all relevant oversight agencies for over a decade. She offered to provide Karen with official documentation proving their legitimacy, copies of their current licenses, letters of recommendation from city officials, and testimonials from the hundreds of families they had successfully helped over the years. But Karen was far beyond the reach of reason, facts, or common human decency. "I don't want to see your fake papers and fraudulent documentation," Karen screamed, her voice growing more hysterical and unhinged with each word that poured from her mouth like poison. This place is a public nuisance and a threat to our community. These people don't belong in a decent neighborhood. This whole operation needs to be shut down immediately before it brings more damaged individuals into our area." As Karen's racist, ableist tirade continued to escalate, growing louder and more venomous by the minute, I could see Emma through the observation window beginning to show the familiar, heartbreaking signs of rising distress. Her small hands started their characteristic flapping motion, one of her primary stymieing behaviors that indicated her nervous system was becoming overwhelmed by environmental stressors. Her shoulders began hunching forward as she tried to make herself smaller and less visible. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and I could see the fear beginning to cloud her beautiful blue eyes as the hostile voices penetrated the supposedly soundproof therapy room. Dr. Martinez, with the skill and compassion that made her a miracle worker for traumatized children, immediately noticed Emma's escalating anxiety and began implementing the calming techniques they had practiced together. She dimmed the lights to reduce visual stimulation, offered Emma her favorite weighted blanket for deep pressure comfort, and began speaking in the soft, rhythmic tones that usually helped Emma regain emotional equilibrium. But Karen's screaming was penetrating even the specialized soundproofing, creating an auditory assault that triggered Emma's most severe trauma responses. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice immediately," Mrs. Patterson said with firm but gentle authority, her years of experience dealing with difficult situations evident in her calm professionalism. "We have children currently in active therapy sessions, and your shouting is extremely disruptive to their treatment and potentially harmful to their psychological well-being." This reasonable request only seemed to fuel Karen's rage to even more dangerous levels. "I don't care about your so-called therapy sessions," she snarled with the venom of someone who viewed empathy as weakness and kindness as stupidity. "These kids shouldn't be here in the first place. This whole place is nothing but a blight on our neighborhood's property values and a magnet for problem families who drag down the quality of life for normal, decent people." Inside the therapy room, Emma's anxiety was escalating rapidly toward a full meltdown. Her hands were now flapping frantically in the desperate self-soothing pattern that indicated her nervous system was approaching complete overload. I could see tears beginning to form in her eyes as her body began the familiar trembling that preceded her most severe episodes. Dr. Martinez was doing everything in her considerable power to keep Emma calm and grounded, using every therapeutic technique in her arsenal, but the damage was already being done with each passing second. Months of careful, patient progress were being systematically unraveled by Karen's selfish, calculated cruelty. I stood up immediately, my protective instincts as a father overriding my training as a law enforcement officer. I needed to intervene before Karen's hatred destroyed everything Emma had worked so hard to achieve. But before I could reach the reception desk to confront this monster who was terrorizing my child, Karen made a decision that would change the trajectory of our lives forever and seal her own fate in ways she couldn't imagine. "If you people won't shut this place down voluntarily," Karen declared with the cold, calculated malice of someone who had planned this moment carefully, "then I'll force you to close permanently." She walked directly to the fire alarm panel mounted on the wall near the entrance, the bright red emergency system that was designed to save lives in genuine emergencies. Without a moment's hesitation, without any concern for the children inside, without any regard for the consequences of her actions, she smashed the protective glass covering with her car keys and pulled the alarm with the deliberate motion of someone committing an act of war against innocent children. The effect on Emma was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The piercing shriek of the fire alarm hit my daughter like a physical blow from an invisible weapon designed specifically to target her greatest vulnerabilities. She immediately collapsed to the therapy room floor as if she had been shot, covering her ears with her small hands and screaming in pure terror with a sound I had never heard from any human being, a sound of agony so profound it seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Her entire body began convulsing as she was thrown into the worst sensory overload meltdown I had ever witnessed in 2 years of watching her struggle with autism and trauma. The strobe lights from the fire alarm system began flashing at precisely the frequency that caused maximum neurological distress for individuals with sensory processing disorders, adding visual assault to the auditory torture that was destroying my daughter's nervous system. Emma's screams became even more intense, a sound of pure agony that no parent should ever have to hear from their child, a cry that seemed to tear pieces from my heart with each passing second. She began hitting her head against the floor repeatedly, trying desperately to make the overwhelming sensation stop, trying to escape from a sensory prison that Karen had deliberately created around her. "Turn it off," I shouted at Karen, my voice barely audible over the deafening alarm that was destroying my daughter's mind. "Turn it off right now. You're hurting my child." Can't you see what you're doing to her? Karen looked directly at me with an expression of cold, calculated satisfaction that will haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. Her eyes held the gleeful cruelty of someone who had achieved exactly the result she had hoped for, someone who was genuinely enjoying the suffering she had deliberately inflicted on an innocent, disabled child. "Good," she said with chilling calmness, her voice somehow audible even over the shrieking alarm. "Maybe now you'll finally understand that this place doesn't belong in our neighborhood, and neither do you or your damaged daughter." Those words hit me like a physical punch to the gut, stealing my breath and filling me with a rage so pure and righteous that I had to consciously control myself to avoid doing something that would have landed me in prison. This evil woman had just deliberately triggered my disabled daughter's worst nightmare, had maliciously undone months of therapeutic progress with a single act of calculated cruelty, had caused Emma unimaginable suffering for no reason other than her own twisted prejudice and hatred, and she was proud of what she had done. She was enjoying every second of my daughter's agony. The fire department arrived within 6 minutes that felt like 6 hours, followed immediately by police officers, paramedics, and emergency medical technicians who had responded to what they expected to be a legitimate fire emergency. As they worked quickly to silence the alarm and safely evacuate the building according to standard emergency protocols, I knelt beside Emma on the therapy room floor, watching helplessly as my daughter remained trapped in a meltdown so severe that she seemed completely disconnected from reality. Her little body was shaking uncontrollably, her eyes were rolled back showing only the whites, and she was making sounds I had never heard before, sounds of a child whose mind had been pushed far beyond its breaking point by someone who had weaponized her disability against her. It was the sound of innocence being murdered by evil, the sound of trust being shattered by deliberate cruelty. "Emma, baby, Daddy's here," I whispered through my own tears, my voice breaking with emotion as I tried to reach her through the wall of sensory overload. "The noise has stopped now. The bad sounds are gone. You're safe. Daddy's got you and no one is going to hurt you anymore." But Emma couldn't hear me. She was completely lost, trapped in a neurological storm that Karen had deliberately created, disconnected from everything and everyone around her. She was alone in a prison of terror and sensory chaos, and I was powerless to reach her or comfort her or take away the pain that this monster had inflicted on her innocent soul. As a law enforcement officer with over 2 decades of experience, I knew I couldn't allow my emotions to cloud my professional judgment, but as a father watching his child suffer in ways that defied description, I was struggling desperately to maintain the composure necessary to ensure justice would be served. While the paramedics worked with Emma, administering a mild sedative to help her overwhelmed nervous system begin to calm down, I began the methodical process of gathering evidence of what Karen had done. The therapy center's comprehensive security camera system had captured everything in crystal clear detail. Karen's deliberate destruction of the fire alarm cover, her callous disregard for the children receiving treatment inside, her threats against the facility and its patients, her admission that she wanted to hurt Emma specifically. Every moment of her calculated attack was recorded from multiple angles with both video and audio that would be admissible in court. When I identified myself as county sheriff to the responding officers, their attitudes immediately shifted from routine to serious. They had been prepared to treat this as a simple false alarm incident, possibly writing a citation for misuse of emergency equipment, but now they understood they were dealing with something much more sinister, a deliberate attack on a disabled child by someone who had planned and executed her cruelty with malicious intent. "Sheriff Thompson," Officer Davis said quietly, pulling me aside while other officers secured the scene, "we've got multiple witnesses stating that the suspect deliberately activated the alarm after making specific threats against this facility and directly mentioning your daughter. Based on the evidence we've observed, this appears to be a case of targeted harassment, reckless endangerment of minors, filing a false emergency report, and potentially a hate crime given that she specifically targeted your daughter's disability." I watched with grim satisfaction as Karen was placed in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence and claiming she was protecting the community from undesirable elements. Even as she was being arrested for deliberately traumatizing a disabled child, she showed no remorse for what she had done to Emma, no recognition of the profound suffering she had caused, no understanding that her actions were not just illegal but morally reprehensible. "This is harassment and discrimination against law-abiding citizens." Karen screamed as she was led toward the patrol car, her voice shrill with indignation and disbelief that anyone would dare hold her accountable for her actions. "I'm an upstanding member of this community with a spotless reputation. I demand to speak to your supervisor immediately. This is a violation of my rights." "Ma'am," Officer Davis replied with professional calm, Your supervisor is standing right here. You just deliberately traumatized County Sheriff Thompson's disabled daughter during a medical therapy session. The look of absolute horror and disbelief that crossed Karen's face when she realized who I was would have been deeply satisfying under different circumstances. The woman who had spent months tormenting my family suddenly understood that she had made the worst mistake of her life, that her victim's father had the knowledge, resources, and authority to ensure she faced the full consequences of her actions. But at that moment, with Emma still sedated and traumatized in the back of an ambulance, all I cared about was my daughter's recovery and ensuring that Karen could never hurt another innocent child the way she had hurt mine. The days following Karen's attack were among the darkest and most challenging of my entire life. Emma didn't speak a single word for 3 weeks after the incident, reverting to the same traumatized silence that had consumed her immediately after her mother's death. She refused to leave our house for any reason, cowering in her bedroom whenever she heard any unexpected sounds. She couldn't sleep without experiencing horrific nightmares about fire alarms and bad ladies who hurt children, often waking up screaming and crying until I could convince her she was safe in her own bed. Most heartbreakingly, she had regressed to behaviors she hadn't exhibited since the darkest days following Sarah's funeral, hitting herself when frustrated, rocking in corners for hours at a time, and flinching away from any physical contact as if human touch caused her pain. Dr. Martinez explained during an emergency consultation that we conducted in our home, since Emma refused to return to the therapy center, that trauma victims with autism often experience severe setbacks when exposed to deliberate cruelty, especially when that cruelty specifically targets their known vulnerabilities and sensitivities. Karen hadn't just pulled a fire alarm as a prank or act of vandalism, she had weaponized Emma's disability against her, using her research into autism symptoms to design an attack calculated to cause maximum psychological damage to a child she knew was already struggling with trauma and recovery. Emma's fundamental sense of trust and safety has been violated in the most profound way possible, Dr. Martinez explained, her own voice heavy with emotion as she watched Emma huddle in the corner of our living room, rocking back and forth while clutching her favorite stuffed animal. She had begun to believe that there were safe spaces in the world where good people would protect her from harm. Karen's attack has taught her that even in places specifically designed to help her heal, cruel people can deliberately hurt her because of her disability. Rebuilding that sense of security and trust will require tremendous time, patience, and probably years of additional intensive therapy. The medical bills from Emma's emergency treatment began mounting quickly. The ambulance ride, emergency room evaluation, psychiatric consultation, medication adjustments, and crisis intervention services cost thousands of dollars that our insurance only partially covered. The additional therapy sessions required to address the new trauma, conducted in our home because Emma couldn't tolerate returning to the center, were expensive and time-consuming. But the financial cost was absolutely nothing compared to the emotional price of watching my daughter suffer from nightmares, panic attacks, and the constant terror that the terrible noise might start again at any moment without warning. During my investigation into Karen's background and motivations, I discovered a disturbing pattern of harassment and discrimination that extended far beyond what she had done to Emma. This woman had been systematically targeting families throughout our neighborhood who didn't meet her narrow, prejudiced definition of acceptable residence, using her position as self-appointed HOA enforcer to make their lives miserable until they either conformed to her demands or moved away. She had filed dozens of false reports against the Rodriguez family, claiming their children were too loud and disruptive when they played in their own backyard during reasonable daytime hours. She had tried to get Mr. Peterson, an elderly veteran with PTSD, evicted from his home because his service dog didn't look professional enough, and created an atmosphere of instability in the neighborhood. She had even attempted to block Sarah Williams, a young single mother, from purchasing a home in the community because Karen believed that single-parent households attracted criminal elements and lowered property values. But the therapy center incident wasn't just an escalation of her existing pattern of harassment, it was the culmination of months of deliberate research and planning. Phone records showed that Karen had called the Rainbow Bridge Therapy Center 17 times in the weeks leading up to her attack, making false complaints about noise violations, parking issues, and alleged safety concerns. She had contacted the city's zoning department, the health department, the fire marshal's office, and even the state licensing board, filing detailed false reports in an attempt to shut down the facility through official bureaucratic channels. When those legitimate avenues failed to produce the results she wanted, when the authorities investigated her claims and found them to be completely without merit, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands with an act of terrorism against vulnerable children. The most disturbing discovery came when we executed a search warrant on Karen's home and found her research files, detailed folders containing printed information about autism symptoms, sensory processing disorders, trauma responses in children, and specific techniques for triggering meltdowns in individuals with neurological differences. She had systematically educated herself about Emma's vulnerabilities not to help or understand, but to weaponize that knowledge against an innocent child. Among her papers we found handwritten notes that included phrases like, "loud sounds cause severe distress," "unexpected changes trigger panic responses," and "sensory overload leads to complete breakdown." This wasn't ignorance or misunderstanding, this was calculated, premeditated psychological warfare against a disabled child. When Karen's expensive lawyer arrived and began preparing what he thought would be a straightforward defense, he advised her to express appropriate remorse for any unintended consequences, while maintaining that her actions were motivated by legitimate community concerns rather than malicious intent. A simple apology, some community service, and a small fine would likely resolve the matter with minimal consequences. But Karen's arrogance, complete lack of empathy, and fundamental inability to see Emma as a human being deserving of basic dignity would prove to be her ultimate downfall. During her formal deposition, when asked directly about Emma's reaction to the fire alarm, Karen stated on the official record, "If that child cannot handle normal emergency procedures and safety protocols, then perhaps she shouldn't be out in public places where she might endanger herself or others. Some people just aren't suited for community living and need to accept their limitations." When the prosecutor pressed her about whether she understood that Emma had autism and that the alarm had caused a severe medical emergency requiring professional intervention, Karen replied with chilling callousness, "I'm not responsible for other people's genetic defects and birth abnormalities. If they choose to have damaged children, they need to deal with the consequences themselves rather than expecting the entire community to accommodate their problems." The court stenographer actually stopped typing for several seconds, visibly shocked by the heartless cruelty of Karen's words. Her own attorney looked physically ill, immediately recognizing that his client had just destroyed any possibility of a sympathetic defense or lenient sentence. But Karen wasn't finished revealing the depth of her hatred and prejudice. When asked about her extensive research into autism symptoms and therapy techniques, she proudly explained how she had educated herself about the various behavioral problems these children exhibit, so she could better protect normal families from disruptions and property value depreciation. She had essentially confessed to deliberately targeting Emma's disability, proving premeditation and malicious intent beyond any reasonable doubt. Her own words, delivered with pride and satisfaction, became the prosecution's most powerful weapon against her. As news of Karen's attack on Emma spread throughout our county and beyond, the community response was overwhelming and deeply moving. Local businesses began organizing fundraising campaigns for Emma's medical expenses and additional therapy costs. The mayor issued a public statement condemning Karen's actions and expressing strong support for families affected by disabilities. Even our local newspaper, which typically avoided controversial stories that might alienate readers, published a front-page editorial calling for justice and greater protection for vulnerable children. Emma's story touched hearts throughout the region and beyond. Letters of support poured in from other families dealing with autism, from veterans who understood trauma and its lasting effects, from teachers who worked with special needs children, and from ordinary citizens who were horrified by Karen's cruelty and wanted to show their support for our family. A local autism advocacy group organized a peaceful protest outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Protect our children, autism awareness, not harassment, and justice for Emma." The Rainbow Bridge Therapy Center received dozens of donations from community members who wanted to ensure that no family would ever again face the kind of deliberate attack that Emma had endured. Dr. Martinez was able to use these funds to upgrade their security system, improve their soundproofing, and create an even safer, more protective environment for vulnerable children and their families. But the most meaningful support came from Emma's classmates and their families at her elementary school. Her teacher, Mrs. Johnson, organized a special card-making session where every child in Emma's class created handmade cards expressing their friendship, support, and love. When Emma finally felt ready to return to school after 6 weeks of home recovery, she was greeted with hugs, smiles, and a classroom decorated with rainbow pictures in her favorite colors. Her classmates had also learned about autism awareness and acceptance, turning Emma's trauma into an opportunity for education and understanding that would benefit every special needs child in their school for years to come.